What's up, folks? Welcome back to another episode of Trump City Heavyweights Podcast, brought to you by Great Eights Memorabilia in Parkville, Maryland. I'm the host, Matt Trigger. My co-host, Josh Merrill, he will be with us momentarily. He's running a little bit behind at work. Told me to get started without him. So we're gonna start the Jags, recap show in a little bit. But first, we have a guest. He is a fantasy football expert. He has written for pretty much everybody you can think of in regards to the fantasy football world. He is a special guest for the show tonight, Mr. Scott Spratt. How you doing, Scott?
I'm good, Matt. What's going on?
Not much, man. I'm flying solo for the time being. My co-host got a little bit jammed up at work. This is the first for us. We don't really talk a whole lot of fantasy football on the show. We do have a lot of listeners that do play fantasy football. They play in multiple leagues. So I play in two myself. I'm a commissioner of one. Just give everybody a little bit of a background about what you do.
Yeah, for sure. So I write for FTN Fantasy. We are a data-oriented fantasy site, at least certainly from my perspective. I do a lot of database-related work, advanced statistical work. We do DVOA stuff for any of the super data nerds out there that want to get into sort of that type of analytical side of the game. And that's sort of my expertise as well. So I'm a background statistician, data scientist, and I try to weave that into the fantasy football content that I do for the site and otherwise.
Okay. I do have a question about that though. A lot of sports fans are kind of met with, they meet the analytical side of sports with a little bit of hesitancy and a little bit of abrasiveness. How has it been in a response with, the work that you do correlating it to football and fantasy football in particular? Because fantasy football players we're nerds in our own way. We're very, that's essentially all analytics. You're looking at probabilities, you're looking at PPR, non PPR. You break down everything you can. Some guys that are not great football players are great fantasy football players, and it's just a whole niche in itself. Has there been any hostility, that you've experienced as doing this for your line of work?
Yeah, I think your instinct is good that the fantasy football players are a little bit more open to analytics than maybe somebody that has been a football lifer, does most of their work in film study, that type of approach. Because for a fantasy player, it all at the end of the day comes down to how many points they are scoring. So, the projection is a very sort of natural approach to things. So I think people tend to be open to it. But I will say that there's some aspects of the research that I do that people are resistant to, like expected touchdown type of research. It's just maybe a little bit too nerdy for people, or maybe they can't get over if a player doesn't actually score the touchdown, that if they get carries near the goal line, that might be predictive of them getting touchdowns in the future. So it's kind of the thing where I think the more players dip their toes in, the more that they'll kind of come to understand and enjoy what's going on. And I think for fantasy players, it's easier. I think it's just a little bit easier than it would be for a real football organization to fully embrace it, even though they should, because analytics does great things just the way that the film does as well.
I mean, I understand, to a varying degree, because I'll say this: I'm not a long term football lifer, quote unquote. I mean, I've played or coached or been involved in the game for a long time, but I'm not as against the analytical side. I was very against it in baseball, but then I started to understand once I saw. I'm a Baltimore Orioles fan, so
yeah.
Seeing Mike Elias come in, the general manager, and bring the analytical approach that he had in Houston to Baltimore, and seeing now that we've gone from losing 100 games to winning 100 games in the span of 2 or 3 seasons, to me, I'm a believer now. I understand the analytical side of it because it makes sense. But with fantasy football, it's a very niche. It's essentially a gambling kind of activity, but it's more of an analytical and a strategic kind of approach to it, as opposed to just putting money down on a parlay. But I wanted to ask you, since you've been writing and doing this for a while, and the Baltimore Ravens are always, you know, a very good football team. And outside of Lamar Jackson, who has been some of the biggest fantasy producers for the Ravens that you've seen this year with your analytics?
Well, I mean, the number one this year and in previous years had been Mark Andrews. It's like, it's obviously very unusual for a tight end to be the number one player on his team, a player that's so heavily featured both between the 20s and near the red zone. A lot of tight ends are more just like, yeah, they'll catch an occasional touchdown pass like Cole Kmet, but they're not hugely integrated into the offense. And that was the case earlier in the year with Andrews in a surprising way relative to other teams. So it's obviously super sad to see him go down maybe for the year in the playoffs. We'll see on the latter point there. It's been interesting to see Isaiah Likely kind of step in and end up filling a lot of that void. It was something I was skeptical of after week one when Andrews wasn't able to play, kind of as a last minute deal at the start of the season. And Likely didn't see a target, even though he was playing virtually every snap at that point of the season. And at that point, it was like, yeah, with the new offensive coordinator, maybe the Ravens were really transitioning to more of like, we're going to rely on these wide receivers. We brought in Odell Beckham. We drafted Zay Flowers. It's been really working from that side of things, but it seems like they really have found their balance later in the season and Likely is able to still be a big producer, be like a tight end one in fantasy, even though he wasn't the main guy to start the season.
Yeah, as a fan, I try to separate the fantasy football. I have a superstition. I don't draft Ravens on my team, and
Yeah,
I'm
I
sure you
get that.
probably hear. I'm sure you probably hear that from a lot of people. When I watch the Ravens, I'm a diehard fan. I've been a diehard
Mm.
fan since '96. I don't want to root for any of my guys in a fantasy football manner. It, so I draft everybody from a completely different team just so I have a vested interest to watch other games. But I don't have to sit there and stress about not only my
Mm.
team winning, but I don't have to worry about what type of fantasy points they're going to put up. So, I mean, in all fairness, I did draft Lamar Jackson a couple of years ago, and he won my league for me. But
Yeah,
but it was
he's
it was just
he's pretty
ridiculous.
good.
Um, Kind of getting away from the Ravens necessarily. How does your analytical approach differ when you go from PPR to non PPR for the stats that you break down?
Yeah, so I guess the major goal for me through most of my work is trying to create like research and stats that build off of something with bigger opportunities than the actual results. So I mentioned that with touchdowns earlier. It's like in a very good season for a really good wide receiver, he might have 10 touchdowns, right? A running back that's really going off might have 15 touchdowns in a season. And that's just not very many numbers to look at and to analyze, right? So you try to come up with ways that show like tendencies that will lead to future production in that respect. That can be carries and targets in the red zone. You get a lot more of those than you get touchdowns. And that's sort of a big part of things when you shift into half and full PPR point scoring, where it's like, yeah, suddenly we're looking at targets for players. And a wide receiver that only gets, 5 or 10 touchdowns in a season may get 100 or more targets in a season. And to me, that's a really good way of looking at it because you're looking at the sort of bigger sample piece, and that's going to be more predictive, even if the actual point scoring doesn't happen over the smaller sample size. So like that's an approach that I'm always taking, but it does have the extra importance when you actually get the point for the reception.
Okay. Um, to kind of ask a question that's not analytically driven,
Mm.
do you participate in the actual, like, how many leagues do you actually participate in every year? I know this is your work, this is like what you
Yeah.
do. So, like, I know you got to study it. Like, do you still got to play, competitively just so you can maintain what it is you're talking about?
I probably do my best work keeping up with everything that's happening by virtue of doing projections. So like every week I'm projecting every offensive skill player and quarterback for like what their carry percentage is what is going to be, what their target percentage is going to be, and all of the kind of math that spits out what their projected line is going to be, passing attempts, passing completions, passing yards, touchdowns, everything. I go through the full gamut. And when you go through that for, 600 or whatever players every week, then you're going to get pretty good at like, knowing who all the players are and sort of what the roles and the trends are that can kind of drive that. So by taking the approach that I do, I don't really have to play as much fantasy. I honestly play a lot less fantasy now than I did before I was even in this as a career. I think I was maybe in 5 or 6 leagues this year, but definitely a lot of players and a lot of fantasy analysts are in more like 20, 30, 40. And if you get into stuff like best ball drafts, then it can be like hundreds and hundreds.
Oh my
And
lord.
it can be excessive, but also like you were saying earlier, as a fan of a team that wants to watch the Ravens and pull for the Ravens, like one thing you could do is have so many fantasy teams that you no longer really had to worry about it, right? Like everything that happens in the real NFL game is either good for you or bad for you. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah. I usually used to be in like 5 or 6 leagues, and
Yeah.
then I kind of whittled it down to like 3 leagues that I was like really like having fun in. That was because you always get in these leagues where every league has a team where they stop caring after like week 5 or 6, and then they're
Yeah.
starting guys that are injured reserve. They don't fill their entire bench out, so I kind of like drifted away from those. Um, One of my commenters just mentioned a comment. His name's is my buddy Kevin at work. He said that tell him that you whoop my ass in fantasy this weekend. We're in a work league,
Yeah.
and the top 8 teams make the playoffs out of 14. This is my second year in the league. It's a very high scoring league. There's a lot of bonuses, a
Mm.
lot of incremental point increases for first downs, for 5 receptions by a wide receiver. It's just like I've scored over 220 4 times this year in one in the league that I'm talking about with Kevin. I was up 70 going into the 4:30 games on Sunday, and he had Travis Etienne, Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, and Dallas Goedert left, and
Okay.
all I had left was my kicker, and um, I ended up winning by 20 points. It just shows how fickle fantasy football is, and how I thought that I was going to actually get absolutely smoked. Like I had like a
Yeah.
30% chance of winning at 1:30, and then it went down to like 9% at 4:30, and we shut down ATN in the Jags game, and then Dak didn't find CeeDee Lamb at all
No.
over in the 4:30 game, and then Dallas Goedert, he had 11 points. I'm just sitting there like this is my lucky start. Kevin was the 1 seed and I was the 8 seed, so it was insane to me how like it's it's just so much luck and chance involved. It's not even really a skill at this point.
There's definitely skill to it, but you're right. Like, especially if you get into a single elimination type of situation like that, like if you were relying on Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb last week, you drew a really bad draw that they had to go on the road. Like they've been so much better at home than on the road this year. And that's just, that can be the way that it really works out. Like if that is your frustration with fantasy, and I would totally get that, like maybe you would actually prefer to play more DFS where you get to draft a new lineup every week. And so, hey, last week, if you didn't want to have any of the Cowboys because they were playing on the road, you didn't have to. But I feel like there's sort of a game to suit every person's style, interest, and friends group too. Like if you don't have the 12 dedicated friends who are gonna make it through the entire fantasy season, there may be some other things that you can do there to have a really good time and kind of complement your real football watching.
Yeah, it was. It's just as a football fan, I don't like to watch in the hopes of um, my guys doing good. I'm a genuine fan of the game, but it's a whole different added anxiety when you're playing fantasy football for money. And um, another thing I did want to ask you though, without veering
Yeah.
too much off the topic, with you being doing this professionally, you've written for many different big time organizations. Does it get exhausting with having family friends constantly ask you about sit and start, waiver wire pickups, trades? Does it get like do you get inundated with that stuff throughout the course of the football season?
So based on some of my personal experiences, I would say it's way better than being a lawyer or a doctor. Like that's the kind of friends and family questions that you really don't want to be receiving. For
Right.
me, like it's honestly ideal, right? Like when I meet people and I'm in a party situation and I'm not necessarily the most extroverted guy, it's like, hey, you like sports? Like it's a thing that can really easily connect people that don't already know each other. So I'm happy to do it, and I try to have interesting things to talk about with all of it. Like, I don't think I would be in this if I didn't really love sports the way that I do. So I'm happy to talk about it at any point for any reason.
I get it. That's why I started doing this.
Yeah.
What has been the biggest surprise to you this year when it comes to the fantasy football game collectively? Like, what has been the most surprising aspect of this year in terms of production from the players?
Yeah, I think, and I guess it shouldn't be entirely shocking, but the amount of important quarterbacks being injured this season has really kind of taken it to a different level than really in my memory of the game. And I've been watching football since the 90s. It's like the entire AFC basically got wiped out at one point or another. Like, I know Trevor Lawrence has come back. Hopefully CJ Stroud's going to come back maybe 1 week or 2 weeks from now. But it's just been like Joe Burrow. I mean, honestly, the entire AFC North, except for knock on wood, you guys are doing okay. And frankly, I wouldn't have picked like Lamar Jackson and Tua Tagovailoa to be the two that are left standing at the end of this. But it's like there have been so many player safety rules put in place that you would hope would ensure that, in particular, the quarterbacks would stay healthier than other positions and healthier than they did throughout the 90s and early 2000s. And it hasn't been the case so far this season. And I feel like it's flipped some of the conventional fantasy wisdom on its head, where traditionally you were like, okay, it's all about running backs. You play so many running backs in fantasy that you have to kind of bulk up on that at the start of drafts. You can grab, the 10th quarterback later in the draft and you're going to be fine. And if that was the plan this year and you were like going to supplement off of the waiver wire, it's been really tough because everybody's going to need to pick up two or three guys. Suddenly you're going to be starting Jake Browning, and it's not the spot that you want to be in the fantasy playoffs. You can't imagine how many people I know, including myself, that are like, all right, we're in the fantasy playoffs. It's Joe Flacco time. That's not where I thought I was going to be in
That's
2023,
funny.
but it
That's
is.
that's funny you say that because Joe Flacco is on my bench,
Yeah.
and I left him on my bench against Kevin,
Yeah.
and Joe Flacco put up 40 some odd points. Justin Fields gave me nothing.
Yeah.
I had Justin Herbert to start the year, and Herbert was giving me a lot of points, even though I don't think he's necessarily the greatest quarterback. He's a good fantasy quarterback. Um, he breaks his thumb. I got to go to Fields. So Fields completely crapped the bed against Cleveland, and it was crazy because Cleveland's defense was the best defense available. So I started the Cleveland defense and I started Justin Fields in the same week. So I had no choice because my options were severely limited, and it was just one of those things where um, Flacco is looking like he's 25 years old throwing the ball out there again. But I'm going crazy because I now probably got to resort to starting Joe Flacco in the semifinals of my fantasy league, and it's 2023. It's not 2013. So
It's been
like
weird.
you said, it's just it's been a weird year. Um, I had a couple more fantasy questions for you because I've really got my fantasy question out of the way. Just asking that because I know I got to start this weekend between the two. How is it with the analytics side? Is it harder to get the data collected for IDP fantasy leagues?
I guess it sort of depends where you are. Like, as somebody that sort of career is built on like statistical analysis, pretty much everywhere I've worked has intentionally been somewhere that like charts its own data or at least has play-by-play data. I work for FT and Fantasy now. We have our own team of charters. So like it's kind of built to sort of feed us with the best data to sort of make it easier to do the work that we do. I've done it myself before, and it can be like really cumbersome to try to kind of piece together play-by-play data from, like online sources from like the NFL, you know, game day apps and stuff like that. So like I've been strategic to sort of make my life easier doing the like style of fantasy football and analytics writing that I do. Um, but yeah, if you are like a casual fan and you like to play IDP, it can be tough. Like there's sites like us that sort of do that sort of data collection for you and can provide you with tools. But like if you're not willing to like invest the time and energy, there's a lot fewer, Mike Clay's out there giving you fantasy football advice about IDP than there are telling you like which wide receiver that you want to start this week, right? So it takes a level of dedication. But in my experience, most of the players, the fantasy players that like to play with defensive players, are like to that degree nerds with the football. They're like, yeah, I watch every round of the draft. I've been scouting these guys myself coming out of college. Like they're ready to go and to take on that challenge. And so that can be really fun if you are willing to do that. And I think in particular, have the group of friends to make that kind of league fun and competitive. That can be like a really, really fun way to play.
Because I did IDP one time, and I swore I'd never do it again. It was just way too much for me. Because it was back in the heyday where J.J. Watt was the elite defensive lineman, and I saw J.J. Watt going in the second round. I'm like, why is there defensive players in the pool? I thought this was only offensive. And there's just so many different styles out there now. You got the week by week fantasy, you got the FanDuel, you got the DraftKings, you got all that. And then you see, I'm starting to see these leagues pop up now where you got super flex where you can start a quarterback in the flex.
Yeah.
And to me, that just it throws off your entire draft strategy because quarterbacks most of the time produce the most points.
Yeah.
So that now you got if you're in a 12-team league and it's super flex, all your quarterbacks are gone by the fourth round. So then it's like now you've got a really chance because I like to try to stack whenever I draft. If I get a quarterback, I try to either add the tight end or at least a wide receiver one or a wide receiver two of the same team, hoping that I can get something going.
Yeah.
And produce. Like this year, I in one of my leagues, the league I'm a commissioner for, I drafted Stephon Diggs, and then I drafted Josh Allen a couple rounds later. But in the Superflex leagues, I played in one of them, and I'm like, round 3, like the quarterbacks were Geno Smith and
Baker Mayfield.
Yeah, and I was just like, oh, this is not good. And this is when Baker was playing on the Rams.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, there's a billion different ways to play, and they can all be fun. I think the thing that people like about Superflex is that the more traditional fantasy lineups that played one quarterback and maybe 3 running backs, they were skewed to sort of the old perspective about football, that running backs were the most important position on the field. And I think analytics has just kind of come to show that running backs are a little bit more like not interchangeable, but like there's so many talented running backs and not enough roster spots for all of them that they've just kind of become less featured important players than they were years ago. And it's like all about quarterback play now. And if you want your fantasy league to reflect that so that, hey, like who are the guys we're talking about in real life? It's like Lamar Jackson, it's Joe Burrow. Like those are the important players for a real football fan to know about. Like if you want your fantasy league to be aligned with the modern football, then like it makes a lot of sense to play super flex. Cause then, yeah, like who is a more important player in real life? It's Lamar Jackson. Like you shouldn't be waiting till round 4 in fantasy to be drafting what could be the best player in the real game, right? I think that's the logic to it. And that can be the thing that's fun about it, especially if you're playing again with maybe not everybody in your league is like super dialed into football and they may not know who even Gus Edwards, they may not know who Gus Edwards is, right? Like, right. And so that's a fun way to get it to be a little bit more approachable and a little bit more mirroring of the real game.
That makes sense. I did want to ask you because when we talked earlier today before the show started, you said that you had some Keaton Mitchell fantasy related information. Now, I'll preface it by saying that we saw probably one of the more gruesome knee injuries, take place with Keaton, and we all wish that he recovers soon. He was absolutely lightning in a bottle for us. The dude's absolutely electric. His dad's a good friend of the show, and he's been on a couple times, and it's just so sad to see how he was just starting to find his way in the league and really starting to get touches. He was averaging 11 yards a carry before he went down, and
that's crazy.
It is, and he had 85 all-purpose yards, and by up until that very touch. But what was I'd like to know what you had in store for the Keaton Mitchell portion of fantasy.
Yeah, so I've got, I would say, good news and bad news for Ravens fans with respect to Keaton Mitchell. I guess I'll start with the bad. Like you mentioned with the injury, So Mitchell was actually leading running backs with 35 or more carries this season with both his broken tackle rate, 36.8%. So basically a third of his carries, he was breaking a tackle, and with a 15.8% explosive run rate, which basically 1 out of every 7 or so carries, he was exploding for 15 or more yards. Again, both the highest rates among running backs this season,
Wow.
albeit with a smaller sample. Like you would expect that to come down over time, but he was obviously special. I think it was pretty clear. And I would say in the second respect, it's clearly subtracting something from the Ravens that they don't have in their other players. So again, 15.8% explosive run rate for him. Gus Edwards is at 4.1% and Justice Hill 4.5%. They're just not in his stratosphere in terms of explosive ability to take those breakaway carries. That's the bad news. The good news is that the Ravens have really consistently, with Lamar Jackson at quarterback, produced some of the most efficient running backs in football. Mitchell was that this year. You mentioned how he was averaging more than 11 yards per carry, where he was second in rushing DVOA, which is one of our nerd stats that is basically an efficiency proxy. Only Devin Achane from the Dolphins is higher in that this season. But Gus Edwards is fifth among qualified running backs this year. J.K. Dobbins was first in 2022, despite the limited season. And Dobbins was first in 2020, and Edwards was seventh in 2020. And I think there's sort of two approaches to that. You could say that, hey, the Ravens are actually just really good at identifying talent in the draft and developing it, which I think is definitely true. But I think part of it too is Lamar makes life so much easier for his running backs with the sort of approach with the zone read handoffs that like has defenders collapsing toward him when he's handing the ball off to the running back. And just the fact that he's so dangerous that everybody's got their eyes on him, right? It creates a lot of yards before contact for his running backs. And I think while Melvin Gordon may not be what he was 5 years ago, like I think a lot of running backs on the Ravens will be a lot better than they would be in other circumstances. And so, yes, not having Mitchell, I think, is going to be really tough. You probably lost that explosive aspect of the running game that you had outside of Lamar. But I think that the running game still can be an efficient thing for the Ravens, more so than it would be for other teams losing a player this valuable.
Do you equate that to the Denver Broncos of the late '90s, early 2000s, where it was just you could plug any running back in behind the line and they were going to be 1,000-yard back almost instantaneously?
Yeah, I particularly remember that, I feel like, with the Chiefs, where I was like, oh, is Priest Holmes the best running back that I've ever seen? Oh, wait, maybe Larry Johnson's the best running back I've ever seen. Like some systems kind of make it work a little bit better. And I think Lamar is just a unique talent that just makes life easier for everyone else around him. And I feel like the Ravens are doing a great job, and maybe a better job than they ever have, of kind of putting those unique tendencies into play to sort of help everybody be a lot better. And so, yeah, I think that they're going to continue to run the ball really effectively, even without Mitchell. And so, yeah, I mean, fingers crossed. Hopefully Mitchell can come back healthy next season, though. He was just an electric player.
Yeah, we are wishing him to come back healthy next year. With it being so late in the season, I doubt it's anything immediate. And if he's not back this time next year, I think they probably shelve him till 25. But with that being said, is Justice Hill a smart play if you are on the waiver wire and you're in the thick of it in the fantasy playoffs? Is Justice Hill somebody you might want to look at?
So I'm a bit of a mixed mind about this. What's been interesting is that even while Keaton Mitchell has been breaking out basically over the last month or so and getting more and more touches, Justice Hill has continued to play like at least 30 to 35% of snaps every week, even with the other two running backs being heavily involved. And Matt, I can probably lean on you here. I assume that's because Justice Hill is the best pass protector among the running backs. Is that sort of how you see it?
He is, and it's clear he's fantastic picking up the blitz. He's our best blocking running back by far in terms of helping keep guys out of Lamar's way.
And so what I would say is like the aspect of the game that Mitchell had really started to take over was sort of the receiving work out of the backfield. That's something that Hill probably is best equipped to pick up among the remaining running backs. I know Melvin Gordon caught a lot of passes in his prime, but it really wasn't on third down very much. So I feel like that's a little bit of it that the Justice may be able to sort of get going. But in terms of like a traditional fantasy league where maybe you're only starting 3 running backs at a time, I'm not sure that's going to clear the threshold, because Gus Edwards is just dramatically bigger than him. And it feels like that the Ravens have really settled into a approach where whenever they're in the red zone, if they're going to run the ball, it's going to be with Edwards. And so I think it's really unlikely that Hill's going to be able to score touchdowns. Again, he doesn't have that Keaton Mitchell breakaway ability to score from outside the red zone. And if he's yielding like, I don't know, 4 out of every 5 red zone touches or more to Gus Edwards, I think it's going to be, from a fantasy perspective, what you would think of as empty calories, where he's going to be involved, he's going to be pass protecting, but you're not getting fantasy points for that, right? So it may not be the right fit from a fantasy perspective. Kind of one of those ways, like you said earlier, that fantasy can be different from real football. And I think Hill is probably a lot more valuable in real life than he is from a fantasy perspective.
Yeah, I scooped him up just because I had Keaton Mitchell on my team, and I scooped Justice Hill up just in the event that he starts to see more pass catching
Yep.
targets. And well, I got you here. Christmas night, Monday Night Football. The juggernauts are going to. It should be a battle of gladiators. Arguably the two best teams in football. Now, the Ravens fan in me, I believe we're going to win. I don't care what anybody says. I'm going to rock with my team regardless of how great the San Francisco 49ers players are. But in looking at it through your lenses, how do you feel about the San Francisco 49ers players going into this game offensively in terms of fantasy value?
Yeah, I do want to point out first is that you mentioned that this may be the two best teams in football. Well, they are the best two teams according to DVOA. That's the stat that I mentioned earlier. That's basically a team efficiency stat. So we call this the DVOA Bowl when the best two teams in that stat play each other. So it's definitely an exciting situation. From a fantasy perspective, like it's hard to argue with the 49ers because they're so like stars and scrubs, I guess you might say, where it's like their handful of skill players are all some of the best skill players at their positions in football. Like obviously Christian McCaffrey, from a fantasy perspective, he literally scores touchdowns every week. Can't beat that. And he is one of the most heavily targeted running backs in football, which is particularly important for traditional fantasy scoring. That's huge. Debo Samuel is super interesting because of his involvement as a running back. That's like a cool wrinkle. It's actually kind of tough to evaluate from a fantasy perspective because you're like, yeah, you gotta consider that this wide receiver is getting 7 carries per game in a way that other players aren't involved. But yeah, I would say that you can't really argue with any of those guys, with Brandon Ayuk, with George Kittle. Kittle's probably a little bit less targeted than you would expect. He does his best fantasy work when one of the other skill players on the team is out because he's so versatile that when everybody's in, he actually spends a lot of his time blocking. It's kind of vintage Gronk, honestly. Like it's really cool. Like they're such a fun team to watch. But yeah, I would say that while the Ravens, for my money, had the best defense in football, and I think DVOA would agree with that, like I don't think that's going to steer you away from starting any of the 49ers from a fantasy perspective. So really the more of the intrigue from the fantasy side of this is going to be on the Ravens side of things, where you've got guys like Isaiah Likely, who like is relatively new to his current workload. Are you going to trust that he's going to continue to see these 5 targets per game? We don't really know what's going to go on with the running backs. I guess we know that Gus Edwards is going to score the touchdowns, but could he suddenly be seeing 15 to 20 carries per game? That hasn't been his role so far this season. There's more in flux with the Ravens to me that makes it more interesting from their perspective. But I think we can certainly count on this being a really compelling game for real football fans.
Yeah, and to put it rather bluntly, a lot of the primetime games this year have been lackluster at best, and especially on Thursday night. Everybody gets a dose of Thursday night football. You know, the league makes everybody play on Thursdays at one point, but it's definitely going to be a heavyweight boxing match with these two teams. Now, away from the fantasy side of it, and
Yeah.
I'm asking you purely objectively. I know I'm a Ravens fan. I know you're on the show. What do you see transpiring on Monday Night Football? What do you think the outcome is going to be?
I'm a little bit intrigued by the fact that it feels like the AFC has started to separate itself at the top from the NFC. I think that the Cowboys' big loss to the Bills, home road splits were probably a major part of that. But it does to me feel like that there are maybe 5 teams in the AFC that I could see winning the Super Bowl, and there's maybe like 2 to 3 in the NFC, and that's kind of like hoping that the Eagles can get back on track from that perspective. So I think while I'm feeling the AFC is stronger, and I think that reflects really well on the Ravens, who have basically played the hardest schedule in football and are definitely closing with the hardest schedule in football with this gauntlet of opponents they're facing. I mean, like The Jaguars are really good. Like, I know the Ravens made them look bad, but like this is like a really hard stretch of opponents. And so I think the 49ers are just kind of in a better spot for this particular game. They're just, they've been dealing with an easier run of opponents. They're healthier. While like they're the team that I think we sort of associate like the Ravens with suffering all their injuries, they just happen to be healthy right now with all their major skill position players, and they get to be at home. To me, it's a lot of factors that for this one game lean 49ers, but if they maybe have a rematch in the Super Bowl, I feel like you never know. It could be a totally different circumstance on a neutral field when hopefully more of the Ravens are back healthy at that point.
That's fair. I respect it because it's definitely going to be our toughest game of the year. I think it's going to be one of those games that literally comes down to the final possession, and I'm looking forward to it because this is going to show us where we really are. If we're just railroading teams that aren't as good as us, or if we can really, go punch for punch with, another team that's arguably just as good, if not better, than the Ravens. But I appreciate that, honestly.
What's interesting is that, like, honestly, it's way more important for the Ravens to beat the Dolphins the following week, right? It's like it honestly isn't going to really matter that much if you lose this week if you then follow it up with a win over the Dolphins. So, like, I don't think that's necessarily going to affect the way that the Ravens prepare for the game or like deploy personnel or anything. But it's like, yeah, like if the Ravens do lose that game by 10 points and then turn around and beat the Dolphins, we're just going to be like, yeah, you know what that was? That was a schedule loss.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. And the way I look at it is if we walk out of Monday night with a victory, we walk out of I think we're gonna get flexed to Sunday Night Football on New Year's Eve. Something I just got this awful suspicion that the NFL is going to put Baltimore and Miami on Sunday Night Football, because they're scheduled for 1 o'clock currently.
Mm-hmm.
But it makes that Pittsburgh Steelers game almost irrelevant at this point.
Yeah.
But I don't want us to fall into the trap where 2019 Ravens they rest all their starters, they get the first round bye, and then we come out flat and get absolutely steamrolled by the Tennessee Titans. So that's just the emotional and the logical side of the current situation. But Scott, I want to thank you for coming on the show, man. It's been a great talking some football with you, some fantasy football. I know that we don't really talk a whole lot about that on this show. I apologize for my co-host. He just, work life got in the way of our shooting schedule.
No worries at all, man. Matt, it was great to talk to you too. So I've had a great time. Hopefully the fans have enjoyed it, even if they're not always like obsessive fantasy football fans. I hope they still had a good time.
Yes, they absolutely did. Before I let you go, let everybody know where they can find you and find your work.
Yeah, again, I write for FTN Fantasy, but the easiest way to find all of my content is just on Twitter at Scott_Spratt. I post links to everything there, and I'll keep you apprised with everything going on, including I got the start sit coming out this Thursday. For anybody still alive in the playoffs in their fantasy leagues, then hopefully I can help you make the right final lineup decisions to get you that championship.
Sounds good. And we will be back live on Thursday night at 9:30 with some San Francisco 49ers analysts to preview the Monday Night Football game. Scott, just hang around for post-show for a second. Have a great holiday season, man, and hope we can do this again soon.
Absolutely. A lot of fun. Good luck to your Ravens. Really fun games coming up.
Thanks, man.